I started the recording.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. A, B, C, D.
Good.
Sync. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Good.
Mary had a little lamb. Okay, I'm ready then.
Okay, we're ready.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Hello, friends. Bishop Andy C. Lewter here, and I am with Bishop Dennis Dolphin. And I want to welcome you to another one of our video blogs and webinars. Today, we have a very exciting topic that we want to talk to you about. And let me introduce my dear friend, colleague, scholar, intellectual, Bishop Dennis Dolphin. Say good morning to us, Bishop.
Good morning. Thank you, Bishop, for the exaggerated marks about me. You know, you always try to endear me, but we're scholars and we're friends, and we love sharpening our swords together as we get together, especially with these video blogs. So thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Bishop, I want to talk today about a recent movie that has been released. It is entitled Birth of a Nation. It is produced and stars Nate Parker. It's one of the more popular films that is available in the marketplace today. But this film is based upon Nat Turner. And so I want to spend some moments talking about Nat Turner, not so much the film. This is partly a film review, but more importantly, it is a reflection on the character of Nat Turner. Now, let me say here at the outset that when I was growing up, there were two individuals that was taught to me to fear. One was Malcolm X, and the other was Nat Turner. And I remember as a youngster believing that both of these persons were individuals that would get blacks in trouble with white people because of their activities, what they believed, what they taught, and more importantly, what they did. Now, of course, once I got a little older, I discovered that the somewhat scorned view and perception of these two individuals was not accurate. And I came to understand that they were actually heroes of our community and not persons to be castigated or to be set aside. So I want to talk about Nat Turner. I want to talk about this movie, and I want to talk about how this movie brings to remembrance where we have come from. Your thoughts, Bishop?
Bishop, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things we need to discuss is the Black church movement, because this is really beyond the slavery. This is really the history of the Black church. And Nat Turner had visions. His idea of what should be retribution to white people in terms of how they were treating slaves had a lot to do with his belief in the Lord and how he was in terms of Christianity. I think the injustice, both Nat Turner and Malcolm X, is dealing with social injustice and how to solve that social injustice. Of course, Nat Turner, who was a very early recipient of this sort of rebellion against social injustice as he saw it, we have to keep in mind that though he may not be a hero to some, he has sparked a whole idea here of rebellion against social injustice. And I think that's how I like to remember Nat Turner, that he refused to be a victim of his times.
Bishop, for those who've not had an opportunity to see the film, and I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but I do want to give some glimpses and some excerpts of the film. What is very, very interesting, this takes place in the early 19th century, I think 1806, 1809. Southampton, Virginia is the context for the film. He begins as a young lad who has this uncanny ability to read, and this is at a time when blacks were not allowed to read. It actually was against the law for blacks to read. There is a very kind mistress on the plantation where he is a slave, and she takes the initiative, seeing his ability, seeing his potential. She takes the initiative to teach him how to read. She does not allow him to read the regular books that is in her father's library, but she does allow him to read the Bible. And so she teaches him how to read by teaching him the Bible. A little later on, he becomes so acquainted with the Bible until he is used as a circuit preacher. But what is very interesting is that the white slave masters paid Nat Turner's slave master so that Nat Turner could come and preach to the slaves. But he was instructed to preach subservience. He was instructed to preach servanthood. He was instructed to teach them to be good slaves. It is only when Nat Turner reads the Bible for himself and begins to question what he is allowed to preach that he is whipped severely, brutally, and he comes into an understanding that what the Bible means to him is different than how he is being instructed on how to use the Bible. He then reads about the righteousness of God, and he begins to have visions. And we want to talk about that, especially with both of us being members of the Pentecostal tradition. He has visions, and these visions lead him to lead a revolt against his slave master. This revolt lasted some 48 hours. And what is interesting is that while it was not widespread, he was able to free the slaves that was on his plantation, as well as the slaves that were on the neighboring plantations. Now, you have a good deal of research, Bishop, available to you. Let's talk about how close my description of the movie is to the actual history of Nat Turner.
The theatrical production did quite a good job in terms of what the history of Nat Turner. His father, by the way, was also responsible with being in rebellion to fugitives who left their state. So he had a history of this, and the books that he read from his teacher sort of put him on the trail of his spiritual journey. So and I want to mention Nat Turner's spiritual journey as opposed to just his rebellious journey that he saw, and how the plantation owners, they played his plantation owner to have him preach to the slave, to show them how they needed to be subject to their masters. And so he began to read the Bible for himself and didn't see some of the things they wanted, the propaganda they wanted him to teach. So it changed the whole dynamic of what Nat Turner was beginning to say. As a result, according to history, they whipped him and beat him, trying to get him to preach the propaganda. He, in turn, started preaching what he was seeing in the Bible. There are even reports of healings being done in his meeting. And so that we have to look at the injustice. I think like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, he saw himself as an emancipator of his people.
And Bishop, and I think it's so very, very important because there is this ideal that we have, and that ideal is we want to see ourselves as one, we want to see ourselves as unified, but the reality is that in Christianity, there are cultural expressions that are diverse and different one from another. There's no single expression of Christianity. There's no single style of worship. There's no single style of doctrine. Even our theological interpretations, our hermeneutic is impacted by our culture and our context. And I think one of the things that we have with Nat Turner is that the expression of Christianity for Black folks who were oppressed and enslaved was different than the expression of Christianity of the slave master who wanted to use Christianity to keep his slaves subservient. Would you agree with that?
I agree 100%, Bishop, and I think that is true. Let me quote a quote of Nat Turner from May 12, 1828. He said, "I heard a loud voice in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said, the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had bore for the sins of men, and that I should take it and fight against the serpent. For the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first." It was clear that Nat Turner saw his mission as a holy mission, not just a violent mission. I think that when we look at maybe what he did in terms of violence, it was a violence time. We could spend time talking about the indignities that were done against slaves and how they were treated. I just found out recently, I'm a Marylander. I was born in Baltimore, and I just found out that they had what they call breeding plantations. After they stopped the slave trade and the ships would not come to bring slaves, they set up these breeding plantation, and there was one in Southern Maryland where they put slaves there, healthy slaves, breeded them so they could have babies and again populate the slave trades because the cotton mill and things was going. Here was the rule, Bishop, and this is the kind of world that Nat Turner was living in. An average slave if he was able to do at least 12 children by different women, he could earn his freedom. And then a woman, if she had at least 9 children, she could earn her freedom. Now, the interesting part about this is that they breeded fathers against daughters, mothers against sons, and sisters and brothers. It completely destroyed the family ties of individuals who considered themselves in the faith. And I think that in looking at that, you have to look at the fact that there was a lot of disparity. There was a lot of things that was going on: homosexuality, white slave masters abusing slaves, men, women, and children. And there was just dishearteningly people treated these people like they were beasts, like they were monsters. This is the kind of world that Nat Turner didn't see the disparity of what the Bible was teaching to what he was seeing in his social life.
Bishop, one of the other scenes that took place in the movie was the scene of Nat Turner preaching to slaves under the observation of the slave master and the overseer. The overseer stood on one side with a whip. The slave master or an additional overseer stood on the other side with a gun to ensure that what Nat Turner was preaching was consistent with what they wanted him to preach. However, when the slaves got together themselves without the oversight of the overseer or the white slave master, they had a totally different worship experience. And so there was a worship experience that was done under the observation of whites. Then there was a different worship experience that was done when they had the freedom to express themselves and to worship God in the way that they wanted to. Now, let's kind of connect some dots here, Bishop, because I would argue that, and especially with us being from the Pentecostal tradition, we do know that Charles Harrison Mason, who was the founder of the Church of God in Christ in 1897, one of the things that he said was that he wanted to get back to the way the slaves had church. And when he said that, he was talking about the freedom to have church without the oversight of others. Would you say that a good deal of the worship style that we have today is linked back to those days and that time when blacks felt free to worship without the oversight of overseers and slave masters?
I think very much so. I think it led to not only with Charles Mason's, but Azusa Street. You have this sense that this was a way for the black man to escape. Worship became not only something that strengthened him soul and gave him fortitude, but it was a way to escape the troubles of this world. Soon I'll be done with the trouble of this world. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Songs like that were liberating for slaves. They went through their hard times with a fortitude that many of us don't have today. And we need to look at, we complain about hard times as if God's supposed to take us and relieve us from everything. But part of our emotional outplay and the way we express our praise, I just finished doing a series on worship and praise, and I set up that worship is a noun and praise is a verb. And though worship expresses who we are connected to as our creator to the creation, it's an interconnection. We were created to worship. Praise is actually the advertisement of our worship. So in looking at that, that becomes something very interesting. Here is slaves who are now expressing the innermost expression of their heart, which has no rules, that they can now, they don't have anybody to complain to, they don't have any counselor to go to, they don't have anybody, but they can pour out their spirit and relieve themselves from a hard day's work and worship and eat and refresh themselves. It became a Pentecostal tradition to express oneself in worship because it did keep one from losing their mind or going crazy.
Bishop, we're going to, as we make ready to close out, and I don't want to injure the shelf life of this particular video, but I do want to say that as we are recording this, we are 2 weeks away from the presidential election. And while we don't want to tell people exactly who to vote for, we do want to express the value and the importance of our participation in the electoral process. So here's where I want to go in terms of this movie, in terms of Nat Turner, and where the church is today. It is obvious from this narrative of Nat Turner, that the church has always had a responsibility in the arena of social justice, and that Christian material is what fueled much of the opposition and much of the protest movement that we have used in this country. Can you talk to us just a bit about the role and the function of the church as it relates to the protest movement and the civil rights movement in this country on the part of African Americans?
One of the problems that really divided us, and I have to go back to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., who really helped with this, was a great divide in the American church between the disparity of Black church and white church, and even Southern churches and Northern churches. During the Civil War, there were Southern churches who advocated slavery. So we've had a social struggle. I mean, you and I in our lifetime have seen some of these advancements that have come forth. We may not be going back, but we're not moving too forward either. So at least we've got some momentum that is going here. And I think the church has a responsibility for social injustice as well as to deal with spirituality and want people to worry about going to heaven. We still have to deal with, Jesus talked a lot about handling the poor. The Old Testament talks a lot about the innocent and the violence and the vengeance that needs to come against those who mess with the weak and the lofty. So with the Old Testament, it is this idea that there was a day of the Lord coming that was going to vindicate all the social injustices of God's people. And yet in the New Testament, there comes a time then there was this mercy that was coming in the Old Testament. There is in the New Testament this grace that's coming, because in spite of what you're going through, God's got something better for you. So there, in the New Testament, we get this love, and we don't have to worry about trying to look for revenge, because God's got a day he's going to take care of that. So we look for the day of Christ in the New Testament, the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, which expresses that the church now needs to look. We need to stop trying to put the responsibility of the political arena on the fact that we think politicians are saved and filled with the Holy Spirit and want to do things. They're politicians. What we do in prayer, just like Daniel, just like Joseph, we influence government with our prayers. And so God will use them just like he used Pharaoh to do what he wants for his people. Just like he used in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he used him to get his people to a point. So God may use politicians or lawmakers to be the arm that will force the church to pray. I think we need to look at this whole political campaign as what God is saying to the church.
Well, friends, for the last several minutes, you've been watching and listening to Bishop Dennis Golphin, along with myself, Bishop Andy C. Lewter. We have been participating in somewhat of a movie review of The Birth of a Nation, produced and directed by Nate Parker. It's an exciting film, but it is the story and the narrative of Nat Turner, slave revolt of the early 1800s, 19th century. And we've had an opportunity to review, to talk about, but more importantly, to link this source of entertainment with the structure of the church, the function of the church, and even the value of the church. We've had an opportunity to provide a theological overview and kind of meld Nat Turner's life with the theological initiatives that we find resident in the African American church. I want to thank so much Bishop Dennis Golphin of Raleigh, North Carolina, for sharing in this webinar and video blog. These are the kinds of things that we'll be doing on an ongoing basis. Please look forward to these kinds of events in the future, because we're excited about sharing the giftings that God has given to us with you, the body of Christ. Until next time, God bless.
God bless you.